Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. The GCLS virtual series welcomes you to the virtual panel celebrating autistic characters in Sapphic fiction. This panel today is sponsored by Flashpoint Publications. Flashpoint Publications is now accepting submissions from all authors with any novel-length stories within the rainbow spectrum. Please visit us for more information at www.flashpointpublications.com/submissions. Again, thank you so much to Flashpoint Publications for sponsoring this panel. We do so appreciate your continued support of the GCLS. Please remember the GCLS Code of Conduct, which you can read more about in the chat and on the GCLS website. So let's go ahead and get things started. We hope that you enjoy this event. And now I'd like to turn things over to our moderator, Rae D. Magdon.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the panel celebrating autistic characters in Sapphic fiction. We have a wonderful group of people today to discuss this topic. We have Annette Mori, Kay Acker, Jax Meyer. I almost said Carlene Spry, but she's our host, and Nicole Pyland. And we're very excited to talk about this topic with you. First, I wanted to just start off with a general question, and I want to just go straight down the line of what I see so everyone can get a chance to answer. I want to know, in writing about autistic characters in your work, what has the response been from autistic readers? What have they expressed to you upon reading your work? Let's start with Annette.
I did get a couple of comments back, which was really awesome, from a couple of individuals who are on the spectrum who said, oh, wow, I finally saw myself in your book. And it was really nice to see that, in terms of the representation. And that was really nice to hear, because they suggested that I represented my characters very well, and I must have done a lot of research, et cetera, so, which I did. And I was very happy to get that feedback.
We will absolutely inquire more about this in a few minutes, but could you just give us the briefest overview of what sort of research you did?
Wow, I did a bunch of research. Well, I do have a couple of colleagues who have who had autistic kids that I spent some time with, and talked a lot with them. And some of their stories were really touching. And so I tried to weave in little bits and pieces that were kind of like it, but not necessarily. And then I did a lot of online research. I bought some books. I bought a book that was actually written by an autistic young man, and I read through that to try to get a sense of how he viewed the world, in addition to going on to some of the sites that do education about autism. So that's mostly. Plus,
I'm glad to hear that, because I think the best way to understand us is to read our works. So that's wonderful. Kay, what has the response been from your readers about this?
So I worked with a lot of sensitivity readers who gave wonderful feedback about what they liked to see, and telling me what they wanted to see so I could make sure it was in there. Don't put them on the spot, but Jax was one of the people who helped me with that. So if folks want to know more later, you can ask them. And I also, the most meaningful response that I've gotten so far was someone who emailed me and said that she and her daughter, who is autistic, had both read it and had spent a long time talking about it together, and how much it reflected their experience. So that was really cool.
Those are the best moments as a writer, when you get to know that you had that ripple impact on someone who read your work. Jax, what kind of responses have you gotten for your work?
So I definitely always appreciate when people are like, it was just nice to have stuff that represented me and things like that. What really stands out though is the people that are, they're reading and they're saying, wait, all of these weird things about me actually could be something. And then they go off and do their own independent research and to recognize that they are likely on the spectrum themselves, or a loved one. Because when you can write and get into a character's head, and then the reader is actually seeing what happens in our heads, which is never something we are expressing because it would make us look insane sometimes, but that helps them understand their loved ones as well. But I'll also say as a reader, actually Nicole's book was probably the first or second book I read with an autistic character, and which is amazing. And then what's interesting is there was a recent book, Sprinkled in the Stars, and that's the child is autistic, and I was reading it at a time when we were very much in the midst of dealing with some of the same things, and it was actually really hard to read because it hit so close to home that I was like, oh God, I don't know if I can handle this right now. Great book. I mean, it was almost too accurate because it was the same stresses as what I was dealing with in life as well. So it can almost be too good sometimes as a reader. So.
Oh, I was muted.
Yes.
My bad. Nicole, what kind of responses have you received?
I still get them. Sorry, I'm a little sick, so I sound very congested. I apologize. I get probably at least a couple of months still, and the book's been out for about 5 years now. And generally it's the same thing that these folks have been talking about. It's like, I feel like I can see myself in a character for the first time, or I recognize some elements of that character in myself, and it'll make them go do some research on their own, and then helps them to identify maybe that they are on the spectrum as well, which is really great. I get some really, really long emails, which is really exciting for me. I read every single one of them and I respond back to every single one of them as well. But it's usually along the lines of just, I feel like I can relate to this character. And I think because it's a love story, it's also that element of the characters finding somebody that understands them. And so there's that search for that person that can understand you in that way as well, that kind of brings them to the book and gives them some hope.
Wonderful. It's so good to hear about what positive responses you've all gotten. So someone in the Q&A asked, what books are being discussed? And I have posted the answers, but verbally I'll tell you, we are going to discuss Nicole Pyland's Celebrities series, specifically book 2, I believe. I misspelled Annette's name. Annette Mori's Sculpting Her Heart. We're going to discuss Jax's book, Dal Segno, and Kay Acker's book, Leaving's Not the Only Way to Go. So, oh yay, a cover. So we're going to we're going to talk about those books, but I highly encourage you to share recommendations amongst yourselves, and anything that these wonderful panelists mention when they're answering questions about other books they read, please do look those up. The best way to find good reading material is from word of mouth and from stuff like this. Oh, it looks like we're going to get book links in the thank you email as well. Cool. So now let's get into it a bit more. I have one more group question before we get into the specific questions. And I would like to know, obviously we all want to write autistic characters that autistic readers can relate to and people on the spectrum can see themselves in. But do you also write with a neurotypical audience in mind? And is education important to you, or is it just a nice byproduct when it happens? I don't think there's a right answer to this question. I'm just very curious about how you've approached that in your works. And let's go the opposite direction this time and start with Nicole.
I don't. I didn't write the book, I would say, with any purpose other than for myself. And I tend to write all my books that way. I wrote the first draft of all the love songs in 4 days during what I jokingly call my Aspie fog. So that's, I didn't really eat. I think my wife had to like remind me to eat food. I didn't really sleep. I wrote it for me. It was just a book that I wanted to write that had been stuck in my head for a while. I think in general, I write for myself, and I don't really focus on any particular audience type when I'm writing. I just kind of write the books that I want to write. Having said that, it is interesting to see the kind of reaction that your books can get from both of those audiences. And I think that I've definitely got some folks that have at least messaged me that said it gave them a different perspective than they had before. And I appreciate that. And I'm glad they reach out and let me know that. But yeah, I just kind of wrote it, probably the best way I could say it.
I think when you write something meaningful to you, your audience is likely to find you and find meaning in it too. So I like your strategy.
Thanks.
Yeah, I think, well, obviously it's worked out. Jax, do you write with the urge to, connect with the neurotypical audience or to educate them in some way? Or are you writing with other purposes in mind?
Kind of hard to like pull it apart. Definitely with the first book, I couldn't get too, I wasn't really thinking about too much because I was still just trying to figure out how to tell a story and how to do all that. And I did that from Cam's point of view because I don't know what happens inside a neurotypical brain. So writing from a second point of view with a neurotypical character, I was like, nope, just not even going to do it. I'm cheating. I don't care. In hindsight, looking back at it, I really like that approach in this type of a situation because it's very hard to understand the anxieties that go into living as an autistic person without recognizing, like kind of inhabiting their head. So if Cam doesn't know something, you don't know something either. And then her anxieties and her overthinking and all of those aspects make more sense because it's the chance to actually kind of view the world from an autistic lens. And then so that Cam's story arc actually is 3 books. So it starts when Cam is like 40, already understands that she's autistic and has a feel for how to function in the world and advocate for herself. But then I go backwards in time to when she's 20 and has no idea and is just trying to navigate the world and the military and don't ask, don't tell. And I chose to keep it in Cam's point of view because it's such a difficult situation. And I wanted to purposely keep it from that perspective so that people could understand it better. And then with book 3, I actually had Cam walk through the process, the self-research process of understanding that she's autistic. And I would say, honestly, that process is just as much for the undiagnosed autistics out there reading as it is for the neurotypicals, because I get really sick of having to bend who I am to make it fit into the world of the neurotypicals, which is exhausting and annoying. And I'm hoping that by sharing just at least a perspective through these characters, now the readers are going to be a little more understanding and maybe the world won't be quite so hard for other autistics. So I'm not sure the direct answer to your question, but that's my big answer.
It sounds like you really, really dug deep for Cam's perspective. And actually, that's what I modeled some of my later specific questions for you after about why you chose that point of view. But I think I read the first book and I'm looking forward to the other 2. And I think that kind of really close, intimate lens can lend itself to great works. So I'm appreciative that you made that choice, even if it felt like cheating at the time.
I mean, it was a total it was a selfish thing, but it worked out really well. So I can say in hindsight, that was 100% the way it should have been done anyway. So sometimes you stumble into the right thing.
Yes, I just have to say, I read all of your books and enjoyed at least one book from all of you and enjoyed them. And I am really glad that you were able to share those stories with the world. I was very impressed. So a lot of talent here in this panel. Let's go to Kay now. do you write with a neurotypical audience in mind, or is it sort of a just byproduct of what you feel a story you want to tell?
So I tried to make this decision very intentionally. And what I did was I started with writing with myself as a person with ADHD and my autistic friends in mind.
A lot of overlap.
Yes. And so I wrote what made sense to me and to the people that I knew. And then I ran it through sensitivity readers, made sure that it was right for them and that it was everything that they wanted, and then took it to neurotypical readers and added only what tripped them up. So if there was a conversation that needed to happen between the characters where someone was like, hey, what's up with this? And then the autistic character, Georgia, would explain, then that was fine because, that's something that actually happens between my friends and I sometimes. But for the most part, I kept it as minimal as possible and just only elaborated on the parts that were sort of a barrier to neurotypical readers without making it sort of a 101.
Yeah, I think it's really nice when a book, and this is the impression that I got reading your book. I feel like it's nice when we can invite neurotypical people into our worlds and our perspectives and welcome them to learn and to see things from our perspective, but not necessarily curate that world for them specifically and for their comfort and needs. So that's a really good answer. Annette, do you have anything you'd like to add to this? What were you thinking in the process of writing your book? And I don't think there's a right answer to this question. I'm curious.
Well, I'm an educator at heart, so yeah, there's always a part of me that tries to provide some kind of education. Pretty much because I tend to write characters that I feel like need to have people see them in a different perspective. So I pick characters like individuals with autism or individuals with Down syndrome or bipolar. I've picked a lot of those different kind of characters, many based on my personal experience with how others have reacted to, my cousin who had Down syndrome or to my colleagues' kids who had autism, so trying to just create a little bit more sensitivity about the differences in the world and all the differences in all the individuals. And there is, to me, there's this one running theme that we all want to be respected and loved and cared about and all of those things, and creating stories that really allow people to care for those characters. So yes, education was a part of it for me.
Well, there definitely needs to be education, and there needs to be first person perspectives. And I think there needs to be as many kinds of diverse books about autistic people as there are autistic people, because we're not all the same.
Right, exactly. Yes, that too.
So I would like to talk to Kay about Leaving is Not the Only Way to Go. We don't often see autistic characters in the role of love interest or parent, and you went for both there. Your novel Leaving's Not the Only Way to Go features a bisexual autistic protagonist, and I'm happy, by Pride, and her daughter, who is also autistic, dealing with the loss of a co-parent. What inspired you to construct that sort of different familial relationship and hold it to the same standard of respect as what we would think of as a traditional relationship?
So I feel like there's sort of two questions there. One is the two characters who are autistic, and then also this non-traditional family structure. And so for the family structure, I think it was important to me to explore the ways that people relate to each other differently and find the people that are right for them. And, I am a person who, if I think a rule is stupid, I won't follow it. And I think that's something that made sense for Georgia as well. And so she looked at this person and was like, this is the person that I want to have a family with. He is aromantic. He doesn't want to get married. And so we won't get married. We'll just do what we want to do. And that was sort of the best way to go. And then it was also really important to me. Originally, I just came to the idea of, well, part of the struggle that other stories have with talking about autism is that they just have this one character, usually the same type of character doing this one thing, and it's only one version of what autism can be like. And then I thought, well, what if there were two characters who are doing this? And then, it's genetic often, so that makes sense. But it also made sense to me because I was diagnosed with ADHD as an adult. And then as an adult, I was
as an adult is so hard.
Oh God, everything, it's
a nightmare.
Like when you figure out that you're queer and you look back at your life and you go, everything makes sense now. So everything made sense about me, but it also made sense about my dad and my grandfather. And so having that connection, even though neither of them were ever diagnosed, that depth of understanding was really special. And so I liked being able to construct this parent-child relationship where they, maybe no one else understands them, but they understand each other completely. And so that's how I went in that direction.
And then I had another question for you related to that. So at one time or another, all of us experience grief over the loss of a loved one. It's a universal human experience. But how did you approach Georgia and her daughter's grief through an autistic lens in your novel? What went into the creation of that facet of your book?
Well, partially the idea of how hard it can be to find the person who understands you and how difficult it would be then to lose that. And, part of one of the things that at least is talked about with autism, and it also for me with ADHD is important, is having a routine and a structure and knowing what's going to happen. And loss is this permanent end to whatever routine you had going. And also this additional otherness, because you're dealing with this loss that other people aren't going through, even if they know in general it's not happening to them right now. And so it's this extra distance.
Absolutely. But that's one of the things that fascinated me about your book. So I hope other people will also check it out and read it. It's a really very gripping perspective. Nicole, how about we go to you? So one of your characters, Kenzie, in the Celebrity series is an actress. It's not the kind of role that you would normally see an autistic character in. It's not the kind of job you think an autistic person would have. But we have all sorts of jobs in real life that run the gamut. But in media, we're often regulated to like data heavy number and science jobs. Or law enforcement savants with bad people skills. Think like, he's not like diagnosed on the show, but like Dr. House or that sort of thing. Bad people skills, a savant at something else. What made you decide to go with actress for Kenzie? And was that a deliberate choice or something you kind of discovered as you went along?
It was very deliberate. I think so I have a day job, and when I started, I'm now over a team of people, but when I first started, I was a corporate trainer, which basically meant I was in front of a classroom all day, every day. And in some cases, I'm in front of people that are 10, 20, 30 years old. Yeah, that's how it feels sometimes. Yeah. And so it was something that I viewed as a challenge for myself. to do that every day, to go into a classroom. Don't get me wrong. I love the days when I wasn't teaching. That was great. The days where I was just at home working, checking email. And I feel like there are so many, as you mentioned, like so many of our stories that we're all different, we're all unique. And so I also made it on a dare. So Kinsey gets dared to go to an audition. And so she goes to audition, not thinking she'd forget it, but then she does. And she's constantly challenging herself to do this, because if she doesn't, it's like she's giving up in a way. And I think what I tried to do, at least in the book, is she still has her own space to be herself. So she goes and acts. Maybe she doesn't go hang out with everybody after she's done for the day. And she has her, Kinsey quiet time, whatever that looks like for her. But it was a very deliberate decision, because I feel like you're right. I don't like data at all. I am not a data savant. I don't care about math. I joke, I don't math. I don't like it. Sometimes I have to for work. I'm a much more creative person. So it just felt like something that I wanted her to be able to have a job that you don't see very often. Because I feel like I like House. Like, I've seen all of those shows. I've watched all of those movies before, but I hadn't really seen them.
It's one note.
Yeah.
And we're a very diverse community.
Yeah, he's very funny, but yeah, it's once you've seen it, you've seen it. And so I just wanted to tell something different.
You already brought it up, but I was going to bring up, I really like the way Kinsey has built into her routine time to recuperate and ways to ground herself, modifying her life so that she can do this thing that might cost her more spoons than someone who's neurotypical. I love the decision that she has such a public facing job, because lots of people do, and it's rarely portrayed. So building on that, Kinsey's love interest, Lennox, understands Kinsey's neurodivergence because of her own experience with a neurodivergent relative. Was this also a deliberate choice or more of a natural decision? And how do you think it impacted the growth of their relationship to have that understanding and willingness to learn through other exposure?
Yeah, it was deliberate in the moment. I can tell you that because I didn't outline that book. I just wrote it. So it was deliberate when
everything was deliberate.
Yeah, exactly. So when we first met Lennox, I wanted to find a way for her to recognize something that nobody else had yet. And when you get really good at masking, even like you can go be quiet by yourself, but people just think you're introverted. They don't necessarily associate that with being on the spectrum. And so I wanted her to have something that would make her go, huh, I wonder. And then that kind of like starts the connection and starts the relationship. And because she's grown up with, basically taking care of her younger sister, who is more on the savant side of things, you have, I think, an easy way for them to start that connection and for Kinsey to feel understood that then continues to build as they keep talking about stuff not related to autism. So that's there and it's a part of how they get to know each other, but it's also, as the story unfolds, it's also about Lennox, and Lennox is an actress, but she's always wanted to be a writer. And so Kinsey recognizing that in her, I thought was really important as well.
All right.
Can I add something real quick while it's...
Yes, please do. I was moving to you next, but please go ahead.
Well, so acting is actually a really common career for autistics. I'm not the right person for it, but since we all mask to some extent to get along in society, it's like acting is just another form of masking. So for people who are able to do that, acting is perfect for them. And they even get to act the role of the actor, right? So they know what the expectations are to be a celebrity in the world as well. And so it's actually a really common one. And so to me, it was just like, oh yeah, it makes total sense. And then you can actually just Google, there's so many actors and comedians and stuff that are all like, oh yeah, they're on the spectrum. Oh, of course. And then it makes sense afterwards, so.
I like to think of it as working a muscle. If you work a muscle well enough, you eventually get very strong. And I think that's actually another question I had, but I'll turn it into a statement. I think a lot of autistic and neurodivergent writers build their muscles in order to function in a world that doesn't understand them as well as it should. And so they then use that ability to connect with people and put themselves in other people's shoes that they needed to survive into writing or another creative or expressive career. And I hope that in the future, we will see more of that in representation for the community instead of just, the Rain Man type figures.
Right.
So, Jax, I wanted to talk to you next. Not all autistic people are asexual. It's a common misconception that they are, but asexual folks are a valuable and important part of the LGBTQ autistic community. So would you be willing to discuss how the interaction between autism and asexuality have informed your work?
Yeah. And it is interesting because actually one of the first books I read, the character was the exact opposite, where they were almost hypersexual, not in a judgment way, but just like treating this like a spectrum, right? Whereas I'm the opposite, and I'm like demisexual to the way over on the asexual line. And I think for a lot of autistic people, in part, it's because if we are hypersensitive to touch and things like that, physical intimacy can be incredibly challenging. And so there's that aspect of it where it's like sex as a concept just might be very hard to compute. But I think there's also this thing of my brain is very busy and it's focused on different things. And actually, Hannah Gadsby was on one of the late night shows, and she was talking about the difference between where neurodivergent people focus on things that are interesting and neurotypical people focus on things that are important. And there's a lot of things that are interesting to me. And so unless my body is interested in, sexual activity, it's not even in my brain. I have too many other things I'm interested in. And so part of it's just an innate thing, but I think part of it is just the way our brains work tend to be really distracted by a bunch of other things. And, sexuality and even just slowing down enough to even notice a person to see if you're attracted to them is just like, why would I slow down to do that? I'm doing all these other great things.
It's really feast or famine. It's like you're either hyper fixated on one thing or it's everything all at once, all the time.
Yeah, but there's also this complicated thing. And if anyone's interested in diving into it, Katie Soros on Instagram, YouTube, TikTok, actually has a whole series about ADHD and sexuality. And it's incredibly insightful. She talks about, because there are people that are, their attraction is a response-based thing. So something has to happen first before that to even happen. And I'll type it, Kate. And I think also there's just these different, I view the brain as almost like there's a bunch of switches, and like the autism and the ADHD brain are like right next to each other. So sometimes they can get both hit at the same time with whatever causes that developmental thing when we're still developing as a fetus. I think also asexuality and just a queer sexuality are all right next to each other as well. And so I think it's like they can all get triggered by very similar things. And so that's why we have that, and going along with Kay, if a rule doesn't make sense, it's stupid. And so why follow it? So if a brain is already wired for all of these things, that's why you have such a very high percentage of autistic people in the queer community, whether they're asexual or not, or gender divergent or not. I think all of these things are very similar and easy to trigger in the brain during development. And then we just go.
If you decide not to conform in one way, or if you're incapable of conforming
right
in one way that's obvious, the other rules, it's like, why bother to follow them? Like, why are you worried about being like a perfect, like heterosexual person if you already are the weirdo? You know what I mean?
Yeah. So I think there's a lot for us to still learn about brain development and how things are activated and not activated and things like that. but there is a very high overlap, and I just find it really fascinating. But also it's very hard to write true asexuality into a romance. And so I even haven't put my own experience fully into it because it's just difficult. I don't know how to write someone who's touch-averse. It doesn't matter that I live it. I don't know how to write that and make it a book that will be interesting that people want to actually read and enjoy. So, random aside.
Well, let it percolate. You might end up with something really cool.
I mean, it might, hopefully, but we'll see.
Annette, you've been very patient. Thank you. I'm trying to jump around to everybody in different orders. So the autistic and neurodivergent communities in general are not great at handling uncertainty. We like known quantities. We like routines, and very few things are more uncertain than romance and all the stuff that's involved with messy, like feelings of the heart. There's no right way to have a relationship or fall in love, no rules or systems, and that can be very frustrating for our community. How did you approach this in your novel, Sculpting Her Heart? Because I think that was one of the major themes to me that came out of the book.
Yeah, it was difficult. So I chose the other character purposefully because I wanted the romance to be a little easier. Not that
I mean,
to be
it's still
honest,
messy.
not that any romance is easy, because when you have two different people that come together, there's going to be conflict. That's just the nature of things. So it's not, to me, it's not just limited to neurodivergent characters, but all characters. But the other character is and my mother was a special education teacher, so I, had some perspective about that and a little bit of understanding. But the fact that the other character taught and worked with neurodivergent kids made her a little bit more knowledgeable. And so when they came, but the messiness, of course, came in because she was involved with somebody else. So
That's what I meant by messy.
that was very messy.
Yeah,
but
the circumstances are not easy sailing.
Yeah, but the other part of it was a little bit easier because Zari could be more of herself than perhaps with somebody who would have been less patient or less or understood the issues less. And I got it was interesting because I got quite a few comments about, gosh, if only everybody would handle communication and romance in the same way that Zari and Frankie did, because they were very good about talking about some very difficult subjects in a very blunt, open, and honest manner, because that's just the way it was for Zari. That's the way she saw the world is, well, we just need to, decide about these kinds of things. And they just walked through all of that. And so I, put those, here's the 40 questions we're going to have before we really become a couple.
Before we're compatible.
And so,
no, seriously, that's what I did. And I ended up married. So,
and
I think,
so it was, I think it's a great way for people to communicate in general, is get that all out, be that open, be that honest, be that blunt. And
neurotypical people can learn from us.
That's right. More people could learn from that.
And that theme reminded me of Nicole's book as well, that start, the love interests were not starting from a place of complete ignorance. And that helped the relationships to grow. So that's a common theme I'm seeing.
Yeah.
Annette, I also wanted to know, lots of misinformed or uneducated people who haven't had experiences with autistic people think that our community is very robotic, that we don't have feelings.
Right.
But Zari's full of feelings. She just expresses them differently.
Exactly.
So what sources did you draw from in order to translate all those big feelings into behaviors through an autistic lens?
Yeah. Well, it was interesting. The COVID kept us all at home. And so I got caught on this TV show called Atypical. And it was what sparked me to write this book, because one of the things that he said, which just touched my heart. I mean, I started crying. It was like when he talked about the fact that he had feelings that people didn't think he had, and that he could be hurt, he could be all of those things. And it just was so touching to me that I wanted to present a character to help people understand that there are those deep feelings. And so that's how that sort of came about. I don't know if that quite answers your question, but.
No, it does. I think from personal experience, I have lots of very big feelings. It's just, they're often, if a feeling is triggered, it's not always the feeling a neurotypical person would get. And then when I respond to that feeling by reacting to the outside world, my reactions are sometimes lost in translation and are not what a neurotypical person would expect my reaction to be. But that doesn't mean the feelings are not there.
Exactly. Yeah.
So
yeah,
that was something I really enjoyed in your book. I want to hop back to Jax for 1 second to talk about Cam's perspective and how that developed. In one of your blog posts, you said it was natural to write from an autistic perspective because you didn't know how a neurotypical brain works. But then you moved on to say it was essential. And I would like to know how the point of view took shape during the writing process itself.
Yeah. Well, and especially in the first book, it being my first book, I was learning even like how to step out of my own experience and kind of step into parallel shoes, but not my shoes.
You were learning to write in a perspective.
In a perspective that wasn't just mine, right? So part of that process was, and it was like, as you mentioned earlier, like building a muscle. Each book gets farther and farther away from my own experiences and, out of, into different types of characters, because I was building that muscle of, okay, if I was in this situation, this is what I would do. Okay, but what are some other options as well? And how do I show even that process of living? What, because a lot of times people only see the outside, they see the action or the inaction. They don't know the why behind it. And exploring that was really important, even just for me to understand myself. And actually at that time, I didn't know I was ADHD yet. So I was only diagnosed like 2 years ago myself. And so there's some aspects of it that I didn't recognize that were actually ADHD characteristics, but with the overlap and everything with a lot of people, it's hard to separate things out anyway. And tying back into when you asked Kay about grief, for me, that was the biggest part of that book. Infatuation, the happiness, the giddiness of new love, that's easy to tap into. That's one of those really good feel-good things. So like, or who doesn't want to dive into that? But Cam's backstory is losing a partner of like 15 years. So how do I do that? And then it's a huge story. I'm not going to tell it now, but I was also going through this. Melody out. Hold on 1 second. Remember, I mentioned that the 7-year-old does not have an attention span to remember that she's not supposed to come in the room. Yes. Said 7-year-old is, I don't know what. Anyway, so basically I was going through my own journey of grief and loss at the same time. It wasn't a new grief, but it was a new understanding of something. And so as I'm walking through this type of a storyline, I was discovering my own unique approach to like grief and thinking about like, how would Cam process this? Because at least in my experience, emotions, especially around grief and loss, are so huge. They're untouchable. And there aren't words for them. It's just too big. And they just kind of happen. Like my body has a physical reaction in grieving, but I cannot put words to them very well. And so it's exploring that part because it's so different. And some people would probably think it's really weird that I approached it in such a it's completely logical to me. That grieving can be this logical experience in essence and be equally cathartic as some people, you know, they like to grieve with their family and they're all sharing stories and stuff. Whereas I'm like, that is sounds like horror. And this is a much safer way and better way for me to process my feelings and get them out would be writing and doing it by myself and working through it all first. And so
I think a lot of us use writing to work through our various ennui and our life experiences, for sure.
Yeah. So for Cam, it was kind of showing a completely different way of walking through the world. And also, Cam says she's autistic very early in the book because the love interest is actually an old teacher of hers. And there are a lot of people that are taught or think like you shouldn't tell people. And whereas for me, as I've stepped into it, I'm like, no, I'm telling everyone because they need to know and they need to learn that that the stereotypes are just a tiny sliver of the community and that we all experience things a little different. And if I'm not looking at them while I'm talking, that's normal. You know, like it's not just because I'm not paying it. It's not that I'm wanting to be focused on something else. It's that I'm physically incapable of looking at you in the eyes right now. And that's just okay. So
Yeah,
for me,
eye contact is hard.
okay.
You kind of have to force yourself sometimes just to be polite. And it's like,
yeah,
so draining.
I use, my trick is nose or mouth looking. And so actually what's really interesting is that's a thing that people use as a visual cue in books, right? They looked at their lips, you know, they want to kiss. And I'm like, I just don't want to look you in the eye. So it's there's always different reasons, right? For things.
People
and
can do different things for the same thing for different reasons. Actually, exactly. That's a good jumping off point. I want to get back to Kay and ask, you were talking earlier about how your experience with ADHD informed your writing of autism. And then Jax was talking about how those switches are potentially very near each other in the brain. And there's a lot of comorbidity, which is a very like morbid sounding word for a lot of the same stuff happens with two separate diagnoses. So how did, if it's not too personal to ask, so don't feel like you have to answer, but how did your own experience with ADHD inform your writing of an autistic character?
I think it was a wonderful jumping off point to have because, you know, in talking with friends, we had a lot in common. And so when I was developing Georgia and Hannah as characters, I was able to pull a lot from, oh, well, you know, I know what it's like to have executive dysfunction or to get confused easily or to have sensory issues or to just a lot of things that were very specific. Hannah makes sandwiches the way I do. You have to spread it all the way to the edge because if you don't, then the bites are different. And why would you do that?
The texture is wrong.
Yeah. And the way that Georgia can get into these spirals of anxiety are pulled from some thought patterns that I can get into. And I also ended up in an interesting place where I pulled a lot from myself for Lauren too. And it was very different things than the traits that I have in common in some ways with Hannah and Georgia, but Lauren, the other protagonist, some of the things that I that aren't as obvious about me are the things that are very forward with her. And I relate to her a lot, and it ended up with a result where I got a lot of reviews and a lot of comments saying, you know, she seems like she's is she autistic also? Or like, she doesn't seem neurotypical to me. And I was like, well, yeah, that tracks.
I think it's great when sometimes it's easier to be with another neurodivergent person anyway, because they can understand. Like my best friend has ADHD and I am autistic, and we're like twins. And so we relate to a lot of the same. So I wanted to ask about stereotypes real quick. I wanted to ask Annette, and then I'll hop to Nicole. Annette, what sort of harmful stereotypes had you seen in prior media about autistic characters that you went out of your way to avoid or subvert when you were doing your research and writing this book?
Wow. I would say the biggest one is the sort of the perception that individuals are robotic and they don't have feelings. So probably that one. And just that someone with autism is not going to want to is not really interested in developing a relationship with anyone. And I wanted that to go away. I wanted that to be the very first thing that she says, basically, is I want a girlfriend. I've been looking for a girlfriend. And so, and I think that there's too many people who have that sort of stereotype of that individuals with autism or are on the spectrum aren't really interested in relationships at all.
It was one of the first books I'd ever read where an autistic protagonist was actively seeking a relationship. And as someone who's been in a relationship from a very early age and puts a lot of meaning on being in a relationship, it was really refreshing. I think there are some parts of the autistic community where it's important and valid. Members of the community don't want to have romantic relationships, and that's fine. Or they might have different family structures and different kinds of relationships that don't follow the rules that society expects, like in Kay's book. But the fact that I got to see an autistic character go out and seek a relationship instead of being like a robot someone has to break through the shell of,
right,
was really refreshing.
Yeah,
and I appreciated that.
And I think the other thing is, and it's been mentioned here several times, which I really appreciate, is the fact that not every single person who is autistic is going to think and feel and whatever the same way. And so, there may be some things that resonate with people, but that doesn't mean that you have to cookie cutter right in a certain way, because even within neurodivergent individuals, there's lots of diversity. And I didn't want to get stuck on that sort of notion of a cookie cutter kind of thing.
Well, there's a reason it's called a spectrum.
Yeah, exactly. That too. Yeah.
Nicole, give me one moment because I totally blanked on the very important question I wanted to ask you. Oh, I remember. So in my own experience, being autistic has really, really informed how I write, like the process of writing itself. And you mentioned earlier going into what you call your Aspie fog in order to write the book in 4 days, which is incredible. I once wrote a book in 2 weeks, but I've never done 4 days. But how does that manifest for you? What is that like? This is almost for my own curiosity as much as the panel.
That's definitely the shortest it's ever taken me. I do generally write faster than most. And I don't know if that's because I'm on the spectrum. I like to think that it is. I think that's my superpower, that I write very quickly. So that's what I go with. What it usually is, I get really stressed out So something's happening or something's going on in my life, and I will get really stressed out, really overwhelmed. I might get anxious. And so I'll put on headphones and just like blare music in my ear, knock out the rest of the world. And I'll grab my computer and I just start writing. For me in general, so I have a lot of ideas, and we all probably do. You have like 40 or 50 ideas rolling around in your brain at one time. There's always one or two that are like pushing at me. And they're like, you have to write me now. That's your next book. You have no option. And I think that
I can relate to that.
I'm sure a lot of us can, but it's like, write me now. And it could be a plot, it could be a character, it could be a line of dialogue. And so with all the love songs, that's kind of what happened. I had a plot, I had a character in mind, and it just forced me to write. And I don't really do anything else. My hands hurt a lot at the end of the day. Now I've created a routine. So I mentioned I have a day job. So I generally write in the morning before I start the day job so I can get that creativity out, because Zoom meetings are not always the easiest for me. And I have several of them throughout the day, all day, every day. And so I'll do that. And then I write, after dinner and stuff. And I think because I'm finding ways to balance it now, I don't often have that same experience that I had. Like, to be honest with you, my wife had just moved in with my future wife at the time, had just moved from a foreign country, moved in with me.
Oh, and then you did this.
Yeah, it was a small apartment. We had a lot going on, and I'm just like, this is a lot. Headphones, and I started typing. But the fact that she let me do that for 4 days and she did not bother me, she made sure I ate food and left me alone.
That's the sign of a good partner.
Exactly.
That's the sign of a perfect partner.
I chose a good one. But yeah, so that I think is kind of usually how it happens. I'll get really, really stressed out. And I just have to sit down and block out the world and start typing. And I'm done when I'm done. When I used to write fan fiction, it was the same way. I would just put my headphones on and start typing fan fiction. The story was done when it was done.
Well, I relate to a lot of that. Let's just leave it there, that I relate to a lot of that. Does anybody in the chat have any questions they would like to pose to our wonderful expert panelists before we say goodbye? I can do one or two.
Well, there's one in the Q&A that we haven't addressed.
Yeah, Lena's question about beauty.
Yeah,
and
beauty standards.
How working from a neurodivergent perspective as an author or as a character can affect how we describe love interests or what we consider beautiful. And Lara has a wonderful answer to this that I agree with, that for me at least, I really focused on what the characters found attractive about each other. And if they're really into it, then even if the reader isn't into that specific trait, then it still creates the atmosphere because of the genuine feeling. I worked, one of the other things that I did intentionally was that Georgia is not a thin person or a small person in any way. And so I have a lot of moments of Lauren thinking specifically about Georgia's size and the way that is beautiful in a very genuine way. And that, so there's this part of Georgia and that's wonderful, and there's this part of Georgia and that's wonderful. And Georgia, I don't think spends a lot of time just gazing at Lauren, but she's not, there are several mentions of that woman being covered in cat hair. So it's not like she's a standard beauty either.
Well, and the other aspect of the question too is like, so she was saying like, fashion is one of those rules that is stupid and gets tossed out. I'd say for me, it's more like it just doesn't compute. And so it's like, what's comfortable? And in a way, I actually worked that in with Cam because one, being in the military, it's actually in the second book. But so being in the military, you don't even have a lot of clothes to begin with. You wear a uniform every day and you literally just have one bag that you have been bringing with you since you went to combat school and stuff like that. So you have very little even that's personal to begin with. And so being a young Marine in training and then going, oh my God, there's this ridiculously gorgeous person who wants to spend time with me, what the fuck do I wear? And it becomes this quite a plot point, quite a steamy plot point later on, as Cam's like, I need clothes. But and even in like the Indel Segno, though, there is that also that's kind of brought up of like, what do I wear to a date, and because it's just not, it's not that interesting to Cam or myself. It's like, but you want to feel good and look good, but how? And so it's very much it's a challenging space for her, and clothes in general are a challenging space, even more so because being, butch and gender, variant, and like non-binary wasn't a very common word when I was writing. And so like, it's not really worked in, but those same questions and challenges are all in there with Cam. And so that's kind of how I approached it. But I also try to just minimize a lot of physical, like visuals and things like that. So
I have to say, that's the reason I was a goth in high school. Took the decision making right out of it, and it still looked like I was making a statement.
there you go.
That's why I was a goth all 4 years of high school. The love is still there.
Yeah.
Well, thank you all so much for being on this panel with me, for sharing about your experiences and your work. Thank you everyone for attending this panel. I love to see the comments in the chat. They were all very encouraging and interesting. And I hope you will go look at the books by these authors and by other authors who are part of the community or doing their very best to represent the community in an authentic way. And thank you to GCLS, of course, for giving us this platform to talk about this important subject. And I just hope the representation gets better and better from here. So thank you all so much for your time and expertise. And we will see you all at another wonderful panel in the future.
All right.
You're all a delight.
At Albuquerque if you're going there, and if not, later. Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.